Renaissance architecture is the European architecture of the period between the early 15th and early 16th centuries in different regions, demonstrating a conscious revival and development of certain elements of ancient Greek and Roman thought and material culture. Stylistically, Renaissance architecture followed Gothic architecture and was succeeded by Baroque architecture. Developed first in Florence with Filippo Brunelleschi as one of its innovators. The Renaissance style quickly spread to other Italian cities. The style was carried to Spain, France, Germany, England, Russia, and other parts of Europe at different dates and with varying degrees of impact. Renaissance masterpieces which influenced other buildings worldwide include St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the Tempietto of Rome, and the Dome of Florence Cathedral. Another defining feature of Renaissance architecture is the proliferation of illustrated text on the subject, which helped to spread ideas across Europe and even beyond. The Renaissance style was frequently mixed with local traditions in many countries and was eventually challenged by the richly decorative Baroque style from 17th century onwards. The word Renaissance derives from the term Renascita, which means rebirth. The Renaissance in European history left behind the Gothic era. It was a new way for writers, artists, and architects to look at the world after the Middle Ages. Before the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe was dominated by asymmetrical and ornate Gothic architecture. During the Renaissance, however, architects were inspired by the highly symmetrical and carefully proportioned buildings of classical Greece and Rome. The influence of Renaissance architecture is still felt today in a more contemporary home. Renaissance style places emphasis on symmetry, proportion, geometry, and the regularity of parts, as demonstrated in the architecture of classical antiquity and in particular ancient Roman architecture, of which many examples remain. Other characteristic features of the era's architecture include orderly arrangement of columns, pilaster and lintels, as well as the use of semicircular arches, hemispherical domes. Niches replaced the more complex proportional systems and irregular profiles of medieval buildings. Renaissance architecture was an evolving movement that is today commonly divided into three phases. The first one is early Renaissance from 14th century onwards. This is the first tentative reuse of classical ideas. Next is the High Renaissance from 15th century, the full-blooded revival of classicism. And the last one is Mannerism, aka Late Renaissance, from 1520 to 1530 onwards, when architecture became much more decorative and the reuse of classical themes ever more inventive. Architects not only studied the distant past, but also what colleges were doing elsewhere. Drawings and prints spread new concepts far and wide so that those unable to see new buildings in person could study developing trends. Sometimes influences came from unlikely places. The Florentine painter and sculptor Michelangelo created some of the most famous of all Renaissance artworks, and these were hugely influential on later artistic styles. His bold and decorative reimagining of classical figures in art also influenced architects. Another influential artist turned architect was Raphael. He similarly influenced architecture in his case with the Palazzo Broncogno dell'Aquila in Rome. This building had a very rich exterior decoration and was a deliberate and noble mix of the conventional and functional arrangement of columns, niches, and pediments. Filippo Brunelleschi is one such figure, and he is considered the father of Renaissance architecture. Brunelleschi was particularly interested in the study of linear perspective and achieving a harmonious simplicity of form in buildings, which also considered the immediate environment in which they were constructed. Brunelleschi's emphasis on classical proportions, simple geometry, and harmony were prime consideration in what became a new architectural language.
The early Renaissance, or the Quattrocentral period, occurs from the 1400s to 1495 Common Era. To easily recognize, early Renaissance has a characteristics of a centralized plan which developed because of the precise proportion and measurements from Vitruvius' theory regarding human anatomy. In 15th century, Alberti regarded the centralized plan as a divine expression in the scientific approach in maintaining God's image through a mathematical approach in the Re Edificatoria. His theory influenced others, and it led to the creation of the Greek cross centralized places like San Sebastiano, Maria del Carcelli, and St. Peter's, and became a divine figure in Renaissance architecture. Another characteristic is its facade, which is symmetrical about their vertical axis, especially in churches that were surmounted by pediments and organized by pilasters, arches, and entablatures. The needs for the facades to integrate plans was introduced by Filippo Brunelleschi, where domestic buildings are surmounted by a cornice that has a repetitions of openings on each floor. Early Renaissance architects also uses the Roman order of columns like Tuscan, a simple and tend to be wider, squatter, and more widely set than other classical styles type of column. The Doric, which characterized by its massive and stocky columns. The Ionic, that is characterized by its more slender and taller column that has a scroll-shaped ornament on the capital, which sits at the top of the column shaft. It is said to be the feminine response to the earlier Doric order. Corinthian, on the other hand, are more ornate, slender, and sleek of the three Greek orders. It is distinguished by a decorative bell-shaped capital with volutes, 2 rows of acanthus leaves, and an elaborate cornice. Lastly, composite has high decorative tops and has a floral ornamentation that is styled after the acanthus leaf and combined with the scroll design or volute. Pilasters are also one of the characteristics in Renaissance, where one of the first building to use pilasters as an integrated system was the old sacristy by Brunelleschi, which was built in 1419 to 1428. Meanwhile, the arches is an opening in a structure that is curved on top, and its purpose is to distribute weight. It is described as a semicircular or segmental that is first used by Alberti in the monumental scale at St. Andrea in Mantua.
Vaults. In building construction, a structural member consisting of an arrangement of arches, usually forming a ceiling or roof. The basic barrel form, which appeared first in ancient Egypt and the Middle East. So these are the examples or the different kinds of vaults. So the first one is the barrel vault, and the second one is the groin vault. The third one is the rib vault, and the last one is the fan vault. The second one is the dome. Hemispherical structure evolved from the arc, usually forming a ceiling or a roof. These are the examples of dome. The first one is the masonry hemisphere. The next one is Roman Pantheon. The third one is cylindrical wall or a drum. And the last one is the geodesic dome. The third one is the ceiling, the overhead surface or surfaces covering a room and the underside of a floor or a roof. So the first one was called coffered ceiling, in the complex design of which the Italian Renaissance architects far outdid their Roman prototypes. The second type consisted of ceilings wholly or partial vaulted, often with arc intersections with painted bunds, emphasizing the architectural design and with pictures filling the remainder of the space. And the loggia of the Farnesina Villa in Rome, decorated by Raphael and Giulio Romano, is a good example of this. And lastly, the window, opening in the wall of a building for the admission of light and air. Windows are often arranged also for the purposes of architectural decoration. So these are the examples or the different kinds of window that you will see.
Early Renaissance began in 1401 Common Era, when a public competition was held for constructing the Gate of San Giovanni Battistri, which was won by the unknown sculptor Lorenzo Ghiberti. He worked for more than 25 years to complete the bronze gate, and it brought him fame in society. Michelangelo, who was a well-known artist at that time, even dubbed the door as the Gate of Paradise because of his amazement. One of the candidates that he bid in that competition was Filippo Brunelleschi. Filippo Brunelleschi is a well-known sculptor and an architect. After he returns from his journey to study Rome, he then reinvents the organization of Florence. It's almost an obsession for him to stand out, which is why he creates a new and unique concept that is similar to the Romanesque and Gothic style that can only belong to Florence. He was the only one who introduced the idea that architecture is not just about interiors and walls, but it can also be an actual open-air space design. One of his works is a square that is in the middle of the city. This is where the first orphanage in Europe was located, the Ospedale Innocenti, or the House of Innocents, which features a facade that consists of 9 semicircular arches that springs from the composite orders of columns. A ceramic tondo above each column, and a tabernacle window above each semicircular arches. It was a charitable institution that is responsible for the welfare of the children that has been abandoned. The Piazza della Santissima Annunziata. Another well-known work of Brunelleschi is the Duomo, or the Dome of the Santa Maria del Fiore. It is one of the largest cathedrals in the world, which dominates the skylines of Florence. The dome brought fame to Brunelleschi because, other than designing the dome, he was the one who solved the technological conundrum of how to cover the 45 meters hole and give the dome a slightly pointed shape, which he based on one of his theories of load-bearing properties of eggs. The work went on for 16 years, and even at the time of Brunelleschi's death in 1446, the project was still unfinished. Thankfully, Brunelleschi left behind a detailed plan which made them complete the project successfully. Of course, one of the people who won't be last in being prominent is Leon Battista Alberti, a brilliant humanist. Other than creating the facades of Santa Maria Novella and creating the Palazzo Riccielli, he studied Roman architecture and provided the first theory of linear perspective in the La Pittura book. The Re Edificatoria is also one of his creations, which was published first in 1485, that became instrumental in reviving the classical style of architecture. He proves that architecture was not merely a means of constructing building, but it was also a way to creating meaning. Palazzo Ruccelli, which he constructed from 1446 to 1451, was commissioned by a wealthy merchant family, Ruccelli. The building has a facade that has been divided into 3 tiers, with horizontal entablatures that runs across the facade. The first tier gives a sense of strength by using rusticated stone, as well as large stone blocks, square windows, and a portal of posts and lintels construction in places of arches. The project was known for its trabeated architecture because of the overall horizontality of the facade. He uses pilasters to visually support the entablatures, and each tier decreases in height. The first tier of the building has a Tuscan order of pilasters, while the second tier has Ionic order, and the third has Corinthian. Alberti also managed to use smaller stone to give the feeling of lightness, which is enhanced by the rounded arches of windows, a typical Roman picture.
The early Renaissance was a fervent period of European cultural, artistic, political, and economic rebirth, following the Middle Ages, generally described as taking place from the 14th century to the 17th century. The Renaissance promoted the rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature, and art. The next one is Michelozzo di Bartolomeo, an architect and sculptor, notable in the development of Florentine Renaissance architecture. In 1436, he began the complete rebuilding of the ruined monastery of San Marco at Florence. The elegant library he built for the monastery became the model of subsequent libraries throughout 15th century in Italy. In 1444 to 45, he directed the similar reconstruction of the large complex of church buildings at Santissima Annunziata, also in Florence. He developed the eyeless church and became the pioneer of a planned type of sacred building, which is the most important in modern times. Next one is Leon Battista Alberti, an Italian humanist, architect, and principal initiator of Renaissance art theory. In his personality, works, and breadth of learning, he is considered the prototype of the Renaissance universal man. The facades of Santa Maria Novella and the Palazzo Rucellai are both executed in Florence for the merchant Giovanni Rucellai, are noted for their proportionality, their perfect sense of measure. He is also credited with being the first to produce a self-portrait. He did this in the form of medallion, to which he is also introduced the feature of the symbolic emblem. The next one is Leonardo da Vinci. He is an Italian painter, draftsman, sculptor, architect, and engineer whose skill and intelligence, perhaps more than that of any other figure, epitomize the Renaissance humanist ideal. Last Supper, 1495 to 98, and Mona Lisa, 1503 to 19, are among the most widely popular and influential paintings of the Renaissance. Designs for flying machines and groundbreaking studies on optics and perspective. Leonardo fused science and art to create works that have become part of humanity's story.
High Renaissance style was formed in Rome, Italy, in the lead of Donato Bramante. Donato Bramante had already acquired an architectural reputation in Milan, but on his arrival at Rome in 1499, He became the basis of High Renaissance style. High Renaissance was formed and was the shortest among the styles of Renaissance. The factors that started the style was the political and cultural leadership that shifted from Florence to Rome because of the succession of powerful Pope Julius II who wanted to develop the papacy as the secular power. And this makes almost all the leading Italian architects attracted to Rome except for Giulio Romano. One best example of High Renaissance work was a Tempietto in 1502 in Rome, Italy by Donato Bramante. So, here is the Tempietto, or a small chapel next to San Pietro in Montorio. Tempietto is circular in plan with a Doric colonnade of 16 columns surrounding a small cella, 2 stories, a semicircular dome raised high on ground, and a large finial. The monument is very simple, harmonious, and comprehensible. The ultimate inspiration of the Tempietto was a Roman circular temple like the temples of Vesta at Rome at Tivoli. From then on, Donato's Bramante became an exemplar for this new manner. Another church who adopted this quality was the Church of San Maria de la Consolacion in Todi. And it is said to that the original project is attributed to Donato Bramante despite the absence of documentation. Another one is the Church of San Diego at Montepulciano by the Florentine architect Antonio da Sangallo, who influenced by Bramante. Back then, Pope Julius II wanted to be memorialized by his nobility and power. Soon, Michelangelo presented a project of freestanding tomb to Pope Julius II, and the Renaissance artist and biographer Giorgio Vasari gives an idea to Pope Julius II the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican. Bramante prepared plans for a monumental church late in 1505, and in April 1506 the foundation was laid. On his date in 1514, he only completed 4 main piers that supports the dome. Many collaborated for the completion of the church until the 18th of November in 1626. Another notable building in this manner is the Belvedere Court by Bramante that began in 1505. It was placed next to St. Peter's Basilica and Belvedere Villa of Innocent VII and was completed in 16th century. Many structures of this manner have emerged, but among the notable ones are the Palacio Farnese by Antonio Sangallo the Younger, nephew of older Sangallo, which was considered as the largest palace. Villa Farnesina by Baldassar Peruzzi, which also known as the Charming One. And also 2 of Raphael's work, which are Villa Madame and Palacio Pandolfini. Political and religious tensions erupted violently in Italy, particularly in Rome, which was sacked in 1527 by the imperial troops of Charles V and ended the High Renaissance style. And the school of Bramante and Raphael, which had produced the High Renaissance style, was spread throughout Italy as the artists fled from devastated Rome. After the High Renaissance has dispersed, the Italian Mannerism, also known as Late Renaissance, that formed in 1520 to 1600, came into line. This was characterized by extreme sophistication, complexity, novelty, unlike High Renaissance, which was built with harmony and clarity. One notable style that distinguishes Mannerism from High Renaissance was the Palacio Massimo al Colon by Baldassar Peruzzi. The architecture shows a greater emphasis on decorative qualities than an expression of structural relationships. These characteristics no longer represents a harmonious balance among the various stories. Another sample is the Palacio Brancogno dell'Aquila by Raphael, which are structures that never existed today because it was already destroyed. This period of free and decorative Mannerism was followed by a more restrained classical architecture seen to perfection in the work of one of the greatest architects of the Renaissance, Andrea Palladio. He is notable for his work, the Villa Capra or Rotonda, which is a magnificent in simplicity and massing. In Venice, Palladio built several churches, all with the Latin cross plan and rather similar facades, one of which is San Giorgio Maggiore in 1566 to 1610.
Palladius' greatest fame rests on his treatise, A Quattro Libri dell'Architettura, or the Four Books on Architecture. Palladio came closest to achieving a fully Mannerist style in his Teatro Olimpico at Vicenza. Similarly to the greatest of the later Mannerist architects in Florence, Bernardo Buontalenti should have been an acknowledged master of stage design. The most important architect of this period in Rome was Giacomo da Vignola, who wrote a treatise, Rule of the Five Orders of Architecture, devoted solely to a consideration of architectural orders and their proportions. Like Palladius' book, Vignola's Regola became a textbook for later classical architecture. Vignola's work was the Church of Gesù in 1568. There are many notable architects and structures that were built on Renaissance period, and we happen to see and admire even today because